My name is Dana Ingram. I'm 38 years old, and I spent 20 years as an Army medic learning exactly how fast a small body loses heat. So when my neighbor's number lit up my phone at 11:40 on a storm warning night, and I heard my 8-year-old daughter's teeth chattering through the speaker, my parents' farmhouse locked up tight behind her, some switch flipped in me that has never flipped back. My mother and father called it discipline. They called it toughening her up. They had raised me the same way, and they liked to say I turned out fine. What my father said to me on that porch, with my daughter's wet shoes still sitting on a neighbor's doormat, was ugly. What he and my mother did 3 weeks later in front of a judge was worse. And what I finally did about it, after 20 years of following orders, holding the line, and keeping every family secret I was ever handed, not one person in my family saw coming. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where quiet people finally stop being quiet, and families learn that love without safety isn't love at all. If stories about mothers who draw the line speak to you, you're in the right place. Drop a comment below, tell me where you're listening from, and be sure to subscribe, because this one doesn't end the way my parents thought it would. That night, I was 2.5 hours away in Columbus, sitting in a hotel conference room with 40 other veterans, learning how to translate 20 years of service into a civilian resume. The workshop ran late. The weather alert started around 9. Severe thunderstorm warning for 3 counties, including Deacon County, where my parents' farm sits, and where my daughter Ellie was spending her scheduled weekend. I checked the radar app the way I checked everything. Habit. The cell over Cedar Run glowed dark red. At 11:40, my phone buzzed with a number I'd made Ellie memorize before her first overnight. Arlene Purdy, the widow who lives directly across the road from my parents' place. I stepped into the hallway and answered. "Dana, honey, I've got her," Arlene said. "She's safe. She's here." Behind her voice, I heard my daughter crying, and under the crying, I heard the thing my training wouldn't let me unhear. The fast, clicking rhythm of a child shivering hard. "How long was she outside?" I said. "Not hello. Not what happened." Arlene paused. "Long enough. You come now." I was in the parking lot before she finished the sentence. 20 years in the Army teaches you a very specific kind of calm. Your hands do the checklist while your chest does the screaming. Blankets in the trunk, water bottle in the console, route pulled up, urgent care hours checked at a red light. I drove 2.5 hours through sideways rain with my wipers on high, and somewhere around the county line, I noticed the detail I have never been able to put down. My phone showed no missed calls. Not one. My parents had my number. Their granddaughter was out in that storm. Neither of them ever dialed it. To make sense of that night, you need the 8 years before it. I enlisted at 18, 2 weeks out of high school, and I gave the Army 20 years. Combat medic first, then logistics, 2 deployments, a stack of coins and ribbons that fit in one shoebox. Ellie was born when I was 30 at Fort Campbell. Her dad, Kyle, is a decent man who builds infrastructure projects overseas. We divorced when she was 4, gently, the way 2 tired people close a business. He sends support on time and calls when the time zones allow. Then came the assignment I couldn't refuse. 12 months in Korea. Unaccompanied, no dependents allowed. Every military parent knows the piece of paper that makes that possible. A family care plan. Mine had 2 names on it. Walt and Sharon Ingram, my parents, retired, respectable, 7 miles outside Cedar Run, Ohio, in the farmhouse I grew up in. The probate court made it official. Temporary guardianship of a minor child, signed by me at a folding table with a notary, 6 days before my flight. I'm not a crier, but I'll tell you that signature is the heaviest thing I have ever written. For 12 months they did fine, or look like it. Video calls every Sunday. Good report cards. Ellie learned to collect eggs and name clouds. My mother baked. My father, who had spent my whole childhood as hard and gray as a fence post, seemed softer with a granddaughter than he'd ever been with a daughter. I came home 8 months before that storm, retired at 38 with a pension and a plan. Here's the detail that will matter more than anything else in this story. That guardianship paper I signed before Korea was still alive, and a court paper doesn't die just because a mother comes home. I moved back to Cedar Run for one reason. Ellie had a school there, a best friend there, a teacher she loved. Ripping her out of third grade to start over in a strange city felt like making her pay for my career twice. I rented a little blue house in town, 15 minutes from the farm, and I filed the motion to terminate the guardianship the same week I unpacked. My lawyer, Meredith Klein, told me the hearing would take about 6 weeks to get on the probate docket. Routine, she said. In the meantime, she gave me advice I have replayed 1,000 times since. Keep things cooperative. Don't yank the child away from the guardians while the motion is pending. Judges notice hostility. So we ran a transition schedule. Ellie lived with me, and every other weekend she stayed overnight at the farm. I want to be clear about something, because I know how this sounds. I did not hand my daughter over blind. I'm a medic. I do risk assessment in my sleep. I made Ellie memorize my number and Arlene's number both. I called her every night at 8, no exceptions. I told her, if anything ever feels wrong, you find a phone, or you find Arlene's porch light, and you will never, ever be in trouble for it. My father was strict with me growing up. Strict is a small word for it. But with Ellie he'd been gentler. And for 12 months in Korea, I'd watched it with my own eyes on a screen. I had a court date, a schedule, and a checklist. I had done everything a careful mother does. That Saturday, my 8 o'clock call went to voicemail. That Saturday, there was a statewide storm warning. Arlene Purdy's porch light was the only warm thing on that road when I pulled in at 2:10 in the morning. She had Ellie on the couch, wrapped in a flannel blanket with a barn cat purring on her feet, and the second I knelt down my hands went to work without asking me. Pulse, fingertips, lips, the back of her neck. Her lips still had a bluish edge. Her hair was drying in stiff little ropes. Her skin had that clammy coolness I'd felt on soldiers who'd been rained on for a shift, except she weighed 54 pounds and she was mine. "Mama," she said, and grabbed my sleeve like a drowning person, and didn't let go for an hour. Arlene talked while I checked her over, in the level voice of a woman who taught elementary school for 30 years. She'd been up with the storm, heard something banging on her storm door a little before midnight. Opened it to find my daughter on the welcome mat, soaked through, a lightning strike having split a limb off the walnut tree across the road. Ellie had waited on my parents' back porch, locked out, told to stand there until she could act her age. For the better part of 40 minutes before the sky broke something loose in her and she ran, 200 yards through the mud, toward the one light she could see. On the doormat by the front door, where Arlene had eased them off her, sat her purple sneakers. The lucky pair she keeps by the farm's back door for chores. So caked in mud they looked poured from clay. But the thing that finished me was what Ellie whispered when I tucked the blanket up under her chin. "I did what you said, Mama. I found the light. And before that, I counted the thunder so I wouldn't cry." Across the road, through the rain, my parents' kitchen window was still glowing. They were awake. They knew. And nobody had come looking. I left Ellie asleep against Arlene's shoulder and walked across the road in the rain, because there are conversations that cannot wait for morning. My mother opened the door in her apron. My mother wears an apron at 2 in the morning the way other people wear armor. And her eyes went everywhere except my face. "Dana, it's late." Behind her, my father sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee. Dry, comfortable, a man entirely at peace with his evening. "She's at Purdy's, I take it," he said, before I said anything at all. Like I'd come to report the weather. I asked him what happened, and he told me, in the same tone he'd used to describe repairing a fence. Ellie had cried at bedtime because Sharon took the tablet away. The crying went on. Crying, in Walt Ingram's house, is a behavior, and behaviors get corrected. So he walked her out to the back porch in her pajamas, told her she could come in when she could act her age, and latched the door. "Kids today are soft," he said. "An hour of weather never killed anybody. Builds a spine." My mother stood at the counter wiping a clean dish. I asked how long the door stayed latched. My father actually glanced at the clock over the stove, and I watched him do arithmetic. The calm, satisfied arithmetic of a man reviewing a job done right. That was the moment I understood something that took me the rest of this story to say out loud. He wasn't ashamed. He wasn't defensive. Nothing in his face was hiding, because in his accounting, nothing wrong had happened in that house. You can argue with a man who knows he's guilty. I was standing in front of something else entirely. I kept my voice level, because 20 years of practice doesn't evaporate in one kitchen. I told him she's 8. I told him there was a severe thunderstorm warning, that lightning took a limb off the walnut tree 50 feet from where he'd latched the door on her. My father set down his mug and looked at me with something close to disappointment. Not in himself. In me. Storm's just water, Dana. I stood worse at her age. So did you. He let that sit. And then he said the sentence this whole story turns on. The one he'd been saying my entire life. The one I'd carried through 2 war zones like a coin in my pocket. It never hurt you. And here is the strange part. The part I didn't tell anyone for weeks. When he said it, my mind threw an image at me, fast and uninvited. The way a bad knee reports old damage before rain. Wood smoke. A latch. The smell of cured meat and cold dirt. It was there for 1 second and I put it away. The way I'd been putting it away for 29 years. Because I had a job in front of me and the job was my daughter. I picked up Ellie's overnight bag from the mudroom, the one my mother had already packed and set by the door. Packed, mind you, before I ever arrived. And I said the only thing I had left that was safe to say. She won't be back. My father shrugged and reached for his coffee. My mother followed me out onto the porch, into the rain, clutching her cardigan, and whispered the family motto like a prayer. Don't make this big, Dana. Your father is a good man. Behind her, through the screen door, I could hear him rinsing his mug. Calm as Sunday. I got Ellie home to the Blue House at 4 a.m, dry pajamas, warm honey milk, my bed instead of hers. She slept. I didn't even try. I sat at the kitchen table with a folder I hadn't opened since spring, and I read the guardianship papers by the stovelight. Twice, the way you read an enemy position. There it was, in the clean language courts use for messy things. Walter and Sharon Ingram, guardians of the person of a minor child. Still in force, termination hearing in 3 weeks. I texted Meredith Klein at 4:30, not expecting an answer, and got one in 4 minutes, because good lawyers apparently don't sleep either. Her reply put ice in my stomach. Until a judge signs otherwise, they are the legal guardians. Keep her with you. Document everything, but understand, technically tonight, they could demand her back, and we'd be the ones out of compliance. I sat with that. The 2 people who had latched a door against my shivering daughter held more paper on her than I did. I'd signed it to serve my country, and now it hung over my kitchen table like weather. The Army teaches you that whoever controls the paperwork controls the battlefield, and for one long night, the paperwork was theirs. Around 6, I watched the storm drag its tail east and made coffee and a decision with it. There is a version of this story where I waited 3 weeks, kept it quiet, and let the hearing sort it out politely. Cedar Run would have liked that version. Instead, when the urgent care opened at 8, my daughter and I were the first ones through the door. And what I did next, this town still talks about. The urgent care in Cedar Run shares a parking lot with the feed store, which tells you most of what you need to know about our town. The doctor on duty was young and thorough. She checked Ellie head to toe, listened to her lungs, and wrote it all down in that flat clinical English that will never capture a night like ours. Prolonged cold and rain exposure, approximately 40 minutes, presenting with resolved shivering, no hypothermia admission required, emotional distress noted. Ellie, who answers adults honestly because I raised her that way, told the nurse everything without knowing she was telling anybody anything. Grandpa said the rain would make me quit crying, she said, swinging her feet off the exam table. It didn't work. I just got quiet. The nurse's pen stopped. Her eyes came up and found mine over my daughter's head, and we had one of those silent conversations women have been having forever. Out in the hallway, there's a poster I must have walked past a dozen times that year without reading. Mandated reporters, it says. Certain professionals are required by law to report suspected abuse or neglect. The nurse was one. The doctor was one. Standing in that hallway, I understood the machinery was probably going to start whether I touched it or not, and I had a choice about what kind of mother I was going to be inside that machinery. I could be the one it dragged along, or I could be the one who walked in the front door on her own 2 feet. I asked the receptionist if I could borrow a chair in a quiet corner. Then I took out my phone, looked up the number for Deacon County Children's Services, and dialed it myself. The intake worker's name was Brant, and he was kind in the efficient way of people who hear terrible things for a living. He asked me to state my name and my relationship to the child. He asked me to identify the people I was reporting. And that is how, on a Sunday morning in the town where I was baptized, I found myself spelling out my own parents' names, letter by letter, for a government file. Walter Ingram, Sharon Ingram. Address, Nob Hill Road. My voice stayed level the whole time. My hands stayed still. 20 years of training. The shaking always waits until the work is done, and it kept the schedule that morning too, hitting me in the parking lot afterward like a delayed bill. I want to be honest about what that call cost, because people who've never had to make one imagine it feels righteous. It doesn't. It feels like closing a door in a house you grew up in and hearing the lock catch behind you. In Cedar Run, family handles family. You don't call the county on your own blood. Not for drinking, not for bruises, not for anything. I knew the rule. I'd been raised marinating in the rule. I broke it anyway, with my daughter eating a granola bar in the waiting room, because somewhere between Arlene's couch and that hallway poster I had done the math. Every adult in Ellie's life had followed the rule, all the way back, and the rule is how a latched door gets handed down a family like a dinner recipe. Brant gave me a case number. I wrote it on the back of my hand like a soldier. By the time I got Ellie buckled into the car, I felt lighter than I had in years. By dinner time the next day, my mother was standing on my porch. My mother stood on my porch holding a casserole dish like a passport, because in her world food is how you cross borders. I let her into the kitchen but not further, and Ellie stayed in her room, and both of us knew why. Sharon got to it fast, for her. The county had called the farm. A caseworker wanted to interview them. "You have to stop this, Dana, withdraw it. Tell them it was a misunderstanding." I asked her which part was the misunderstanding, the latch, the lightning, or the 40 minutes. She flinched at the number and recovered, and then my mother, who has never once in my hearing raised her voice, laid out her whole constitution in 2 sentences. Family handles family. We do not send the government into each other's houses. I said, "He locked an 8-year-old outside in a storm warning, Mom. You watched." And she came back with the second half of the family catechism, the one she'd been saving, the one that landed harder than anything my father said in his kitchen, because she offered it as comfort. "He raised you the exact same way, honey, and you turned out fine." She reached across my counter and patted my hand when she said it. You turned out fine. There it was. My whole childhood, notarized in 4 gentle words by the woman who witnessed it. I looked at her hand on mine. The same hand that wiped a clean dish while her granddaughter shivered on a neighbor's couch, and I understood I wasn't going to reach her. Maybe not ever. What stayed with me after she left wasn't the arguing. It's that in 40 minutes on my porch and in my kitchen, my mother never once asked how Ellie was sleeping. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived from the Deacon County Probate Court, and I learned my parents were not planning to go quietly. They had lawyered up, a firm out of the county seat, and filed a formal objection to my motion to terminate the guardianship. I stood at my kitchen counter and read what the 2 people who raised me were telling a judge about me. That I had voluntarily absented myself from my child's life for a year. That the child was thriving in their stable, established home. That the mother's living situation was recent and unproven, her civilian employment not yet secured. That the mother had a documented history of mental health treatment. Page 4 had a line that stopped my breathing for a second, neat as a bayonet. They requested the court-ordered disclosure of my counseling records from the VA, my therapy. The thing I had done right. The thing the Army spent 20 years teaching us to finally stop hiding, dressed up in a pleading as evidence I was unfit. Let me pause here, one mother to whoever's listening. If you have ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping a child safe, I'd truly like to hear which one you chose and what it cost you. Leave it in the comments, because I read them, and somebody out there is at their own kitchen counter tonight, holding their own envelope. And stay with me, because my parents' next move was aimed at the one thing I had left that they could still reach. And the lawyer I was about to sit across from was going to say the words no soldier ever wants to hear. This fight might not be winnable clean. Meredith Klein's office smells like coffee and paper, and she doesn't sugarcoat, which is why I hired her. She spread the objection across her desk like a map of bad terrain. Here's their theory, she said. Absent mother, damaged veteran, unstable transition. They don't have to prove you're a monster. They just have to make a judge hesitate. I asked how a year of orders I couldn't refuse becomes abandonment. She looked at me over her glasses. Because you're the mother. If you were a father home from deployment, you'd get a parade. Mothers get a question mark. It's not fair. It's not written down anywhere. And I watch it walk into courtrooms every year. And the counseling records? I'd done 6 months at the VA Vet Center after retirement, standard readjustment work, the thing every command and every poster begs soldiers to do. Klein said they'd request the file and paint whatever was in it in the worst light. We can fight the disclosure. Privilege is on our side. But understand what they're doing, Dana. They aren't attacking your weaknesses. They're attacking your strengths, your service, your discipline, your honesty about getting help. They're going to hold every one of them upside down. I thought about my father at my retirement ceremony 8 months earlier, shaking my colonel's hand, telling anyone who'd listen that the Army was the best thing that ever happened to me. Now the word PTSD sat in his court filing with my name stapled to it. There's a specific taste to that kind of betrayal, and I won't pretend I've fully spit it out. Klein slid a legal pad toward me. So, before we plan anything, tell me what you want, and tell me what you can afford to lose. That night, after Ellie was asleep, I cleared my kitchen table and laid the war out where I could see it. On one side, the court papers, their objection, my motion, the guardianship I'd signed at a folding table before Korea. On the other side, I set down the thing I'd been keeping in the hall closet since the morning after the storm. A gallon freezer bag, zipped shut, holding one pair of small purple sneakers still caked in dried mud from a 200-yard run through a storm. I'd sealed them that first morning without fully knowing why. 20 years of instinct. Preserve the evidence, log the scene, bag and tag. But standing at my own kitchen table at midnight, I finally understood what I'd actually put in that bag. That was the exact shape and weight of what my family called a lesson. Mud from the field between my father's latch and the only porch light my daughter could find. I put the bag right next to their legal filings, and I looked at both piles for a long time. Their paper, her shoes, and every road in my life quietly reduced itself to one fork. Settle it soft. Keep the town's peace, stay somebody's daughter, or pick up the shoes and fight like they were the only paper that counted. I picked up my phone and typed a message to Meredith Klein, short enough to fit on a headstone, which felt right. We fight. All the way. She replied with a thumbs up at 12:14 a.m., and I slept better than I had since the storm. The next hit, when it came from nowhere on my map. It came from church. Before church, though, came one more piece of mail, and I need you to hear this part, because it's the moment this stopped being a custody case for me and became something older. Their attorney filed a response to the Children's Services involvement, and Klein forwarded me the copy. Most of it was standard lawyer weather, but item 12 stood alone, and I have it memorized. The respondents deny that any harm occurred. The discipline in question reflects long-standing, reasonable child-rearing practice in the respondent's family. Similar discipline never harmed the child's mother. There it was. It never hurt you. Shaved, combed, and dressed in a suit. My father's kitchen table sentence had crawled into a legal document because to him and now to his lawyers it wasn't an excuse. It was a defense, a philosophy with a paper trail. They were not denying the latch or the storm or the 40 minutes. They were standing behind all of it, under oath, on letterhead. I read item 12 maybe 10 times at my counter, and something in me went very still and very clear, the way a room does when the power cuts out. This hearing was never going to be about one Saturday night in April. Their own filing had made sure of that. It was going to be about the practice, long-standing, as advertised, which meant it was going to be about the first child ever latched out of that farmhouse, the one who grew up, enlisted, and spent 29 years telling herself it made her strong. Klein called that afternoon with logistics. The county had scheduled its home visits. Both homes, standard procedure, a caseworker with a clipboard walking through my parents' kitchen and mine. "Be yourself," she said. "And Dana, let Ellie be herself too. That child is the truest witness in this whole file." The investigation took 2 weeks, and I got most of it in pieces, from Brant's careful phone updates, from Arlene, and later from the file itself. The caseworker interviewed Ellie at school with a soft-voiced specialist, the kind who asks a child to draw her weekend instead of describe it. Ellie drew the farmhouse, the porch, rain in hard diagonal pencil strokes, and a small stick figure behind a door with a tiny rectangle where the latch goes. She drew Arlene's porch light the size of the sun. Brant visited my house, checked the fridge, the smoke detectors, Ellie's room with the weather maps she likes to draw taped over the bed, and stayed for a cup of coffee he didn't have to accept. Then he drove out to Nob Hill Road, and this is the part I want you to sit with. My father did not soften a single syllable. He walked the caseworker to the back porch, showed him the latch, and explained his system the way a man demonstrates a wood splitter. "Kids need weather," he said, for the record, to a child welfare worker holding a clipboard. "Crying is a habit, and habits break outdoors." My mother served coffee cake and, according to the file's dry little summary I read weeks later, used the word discipline over and over, and never once the word sorry. Their honesty was the strangest gift anyone ever handed my case. No cover story, no contradiction to untangle. Just the doctrine, delivered on the record and in dry weather, by the man who wrote it. Brant is trained to keep his conclusions off his face, and he did. But the preliminary findings would be ready before the hearing, and in a town like Cedar Run, I learned long ago that news travels faster than the mail, and rumor travels faster than news. Rumor beat the county's report to the whole town by 10 days. My Aunt Bev, my father's sister and Cedar Run's unofficial broadcast tower, called me on a Tuesday and opened with, "So it's true, you're trying to put your own father in prison." I told her no one was going to prison. I was ending a guardianship. She talked over me for 6 unbroken minutes. About respect. About how her generation got the belt and built this whole county anyway. About what people at church were saying. That Sunday, the church piece stopped being abstract. My mother has run the women's bake table at First Baptist for 22 years, and those same women had known me since the nursery. In the aisle of Yoder's grocery, 2 of them looked at my cart, looked at me, and rearranged their faces the way you'd cover a casserole with foil. Nobody was rude. Cedar Run doesn't do rude. It does quiet, and the quiet has edges. I could carry that. I've been frozen out of better rooms by worse people. Then it reached my daughter. A birthday party Ellie had been counting down to for 2 weeks. A trampoline, a unicorn cake, the whole 3rd grade social season. Evaporated with a text from the birthday girl's mother. "So sorry, we've had to trim the guest list." Ellie sat at our table with her weather maps and asked me the question I will be answering for the rest of my life. Did I do something bad? I told her the truth. "No, baby, you did something brave, and some grown-ups can't tell the difference yet." She nodded like a little soldier, which broke me worse than tears would have. And then, that same evening, headlights swung into my driveway. Arlene Purdy, with a pie. Arlene set the pie on my counter, took off her rain bonnet, and said, "30 years teaching 2nd grade, Dana. I know exactly what I saw on my doormat, and I intend to say so to a judge." She said it the way she probably announced spelling tests. No drama, no negotiation, next item of business. Over coffee, she told me things I'd never heard from anyone in this town, about the kids who came through her classroom already trained not to flinch. "Everybody praises those children for being tough," she said, stirring her cup slowly. "I watched the lights go out of them one recess at a time. Tough is what we call it, so we don't have to call it anything else." I wrote that down that night, word for word. because some sentences deserve preserving. Those weeks gave us other small mercies too. I found Ellie a children's counselor 2 towns over, a gentle woman with a sand tray, and my daughter took to her fast. Her nightmares thinned from every night to some nights. At home, she went back to her weather maps, big crayon systems with cold fronts and pressure lines, and one evening I noticed she'd started marking a little square on every map, always in the same spot, labeled in careful third-grade letters, Safe House. It was our blue house. Every storm she drew on every map, our house stood marked and standing. I taped that one inside the kitchen cabinet where I keep my coffee, so I'd see it every morning at the worst hour. We were going to need it, because the next week, the court appointed a guardian ad litem to speak for Ellie's interests, and my parents' lawyers filed notice of a new witness list, longer than mine. The guardian ad litem's name was Tom Reyes, a rumpled, watchful man whose entire job was to be Ellie's voice in a room full of adults with lawyers. He interviewed me at the Blue House for 2 hours, then spent an afternoon at the farm, then met with Ellie twice, once with the sand tray at her counselor's office. He was unreadable in a way I respected and hated at the same time. After his second visit with my daughter, he stood on my porch, putting on his coat, and asked her one last question through the screen door. I only caught the shape of it, something about where she feels safest, and whatever she answered, he wrote it in his little notebook, nodded once, and drove off with the recommendation that would carry more weight with the magistrate than anything I could say. Meanwhile, Klein began preparing me for cross-examination, and those evenings in her office were their own kind of combat training. She played opposing counsel, and she did not play nice. "When were you last in a combat zone, Ms. Ingram? Do you take anything to sleep? You missed your daughter's 7th birthday, didn't you? Where were you exactly? Describe your nightmares for the court." I sat in the chair and took it, round after round, and somewhere in round 3 I recognized the feeling from the worst days of my service. The battlefield was my own file. Every scar I'd earned honestly was an exhibit now. Every wise thing I'd done, the counseling, the careful transition schedule, the phone call to the county, could be flipped and held upside down. "Good," Klein said finally, closing her legal pad. "You don't rattle. Now go home and sleep, because tomorrow the other side wants to meet. All of us. One room, a mediator, one honest try at ending this without a trial." The mediation room at the county building had a long table, bad coffee, and a box of tissues nobody touched. My parents sat across from me with their lawyer. I sat with Klein. A retired judge named Whitfield sat at the end and tried to build a bridge out of air. It went the way you'd expect for an hour. Positions, terms, careful lawyer sentences, until Whitfield asked my father, almost gently, whether he could understand why that night in the storm frightened people. And my father, instead of answering, went somewhere else. "I was 9, he said in a voice I had never heard him use, and my old man took me out on Miller Pond in January to check the ice fishing lines. Ice let go under me. I went into my chest." He looked at his hands on the table, and his hands— I want this on the record. His hands were shaking. He stood on the bank and watched me climb out myself. Then he walked home ahead of me, and I followed his boot prints 2 miles, froze half solid, and nobody carried me. Nobody ever carried me anywhere. For one long second the room held something almost holy, and I saw him, a boy on a frozen bank, 60 years back, waiting for a hand that never came down. I know that boy. I've been that boy. Then my father lifted his head and the window closed like weather. "And it made me a man," he said, voice level again. "Everything I am got built out on that ice. That's what you're stealing from that little girl, Dana. You're raising her to wait for rescuing." He straightened his jacket. "I'll not apologize for the one thing I know how to do." The mediation failed inside the next 10 minutes. In the parking lot, my mother took 3 fast steps after me, mouth open, hand half raised, then stopped, folded the hand into her cardigan, and went back to his truck. Litigation is a slow leak, and by the 5th week I could name everything it was draining. Money, first. The retainer, The filings, the expert consult, $12,000 and climbing, a number I tracked on the whiteboard next to my grocery list because pretending not to know a number has never once made it smaller. Standing, second. In Yoder's grocery one Thursday, my Aunt Bev held court by the deli case with two church ladies, and she made sure I heard her over the sliced ham. All I'm saying is, Walt raised that girl with the same hand, and she turned out fine, didn't she? One of the ladies glanced at me and had the decency to study her shoes. Fine. There was that word again, following me around town wearing my mother's voice. Third, and I'll say this plainly, because I promised myself I'd tell this story straight. It drained me. I served 20 years, 2 of them in places I still visit at 3 in the morning, and I sat in more than one briefing where we begged soldiers to ask for help like it was a battle drill. So hear the joke I told my counselor Ray at the vet center that week, the one he didn't laugh at. I have called in a medevac under fire with steady hands, and it took me 38 years to learn to make the phone call that just says, "I'm not okay. Come sit with me." Ray, who was a corpsman in another war before mine, looked at me for a while. Then he said the thing I ended up carrying into that courtroom. "Dana, you keep saying your dad's discipline is what got you through the war. Any chance the war is also what's getting you through your dad?" I was still turning that over on Friday when Klein called. The county's report was in. Before I tell you what the county decided, let me say one thing to whoever's listening with a report like this sitting on their own kitchen table. I see you, and the rest of this story is for you. So, if you haven't yet, take 2 seconds, hit subscribe, and stay with me to the end, because the hardest choice in this whole story has still not happened. Klein read me the disposition over the phone, and I stood in my kitchen holding the counter. Deacon County Children's Services had completed its assessment. Finding, substantiated, neglect, endangering circumstances, as to Walter Ingram. My mother was named in the narrative, unsubstantiated as to her, a distinction I understood and hated and understood. The report cited the storm warning, the latch, the duration, the temperature, the urgent care record, Arlene's statement, and my father's own words to the caseworker, quoted at length, because he had handed them over like a man donating to a museum. "Kids need weather." I read that line in his voice and had to sit down. Then Klein gave me the other half, because there's always another half. The county prosecutor had reviewed the file for criminal child endangerment and declined to file charges, proving intent beyond a reasonable doubt against a 69-year-old grandfather with no record. In this county, in front of a jury of his neighbors, was a fight the state didn't want. So, substantiated on paper, prosecuted, never. "And one more thing," she said. "The lawyer thing, the true thing. The county's finding helps us, but probate is its own animal. A judge could still leave the door open for them." Nothing is finished, Dana. Which is exactly when the other side reached out. Not with a filing this time, with an offer. The offer came through their attorney on a Tuesday, printed on heavy paper, and I will give it this much. It was smart. My parents would withdraw their objection entirely. The guardianship would terminate by agreement. No trial, no testimony, no cross-examination of anybody. I would have full legal custody of my daughter within the week. In exchange, 2 conditions. 1. A standing visitation schedule, 1 weekend a month at the farm, unsupervised, written into the entry. 2. A mutual non-disparagement clause, which is lawyer for what happens in this family, stays in this family. No one repeats the county's findings, no one testifies about anyone, the file closes and the town moves on. Klein laid it on her desk and, for the first time since I'd hired her, leaned back and told me to think hard about taking it. I don't say this often. Trials are dice, Dana. I don't care how good our facts are. You're a single veteran mother with a counseling file in front of a small county magistrate against 2 pillars of the local church. This paper is certainty. Certainty. Next week. Forever. As your lawyer, I am telling you it's a good deal. And the want in me, the part that had been marching on checklist and caffeine for 6 weeks, stood up at attention and said, "Take it, soldier. Mission accomplished. Bring your daughter home." But I kept reading it, And the deal had a shape under the shape. 1 weekend a month, my daughter would sleep behind that latch again, with a court's blessing this time, and I would sign away my voice on the way out the door. The silence I grew up marinating in, family handles family, typed up, notarized, and made binding on the next generation. I told Klein I'd answer by the deadline. The deadline was 9 o'clock, the morning of the hearing. I had one night left, and I spent it exactly where you'd think. I spent it on the edge of my daughter's bed. Ellie was half asleep under her quilt, her newest weather map taped to the headboard. Our blue house marked "Safe House" in the corner in careful capitals. I was memorizing her face the way you do before a mission when she surfaced and looked at me with those steady 8-year-old eyes. "Mom, do I have to go back to Grandpa's farm?" I gave her the honest answer, which was that a judge was going to help us decide, and that whatever happened, I would be there. She was quiet for a while, working something out, and then my daughter, 8 years old, 54 pounds, the bravest soul I have ever shared a foxhole of a house with, patted my hand exactly the way my mother pats hands and said, "It's okay, Mom. If there's a storm again, I'll just count the thunder so I don't cry." She said it to comfort me. Hear that? She had already packed the lesson into her little rucksack, already folded it neat. When they lock you out, you don't get rescued, you get quiet. 1 generation. That's all it took. 1 weekend schedule and 1 latch, and the doctrine had already crossed into her. The way it crossed into me in a smokehouse I hadn't let myself think about in 29 years, wood smoke and cured meat and cold dirt. A 9-year-old counting thunder in the dark and deciding, with a child's terrible clarity, that crying was a defect and she would fix it herself. I sat with my sleeping daughter until midnight, and then I went to the kitchen, picked up the freezer bag with the purple sneakers, held it in my lap like a folded flag, and typed the message to Klein that ended one version of my life and started another. No deal. Put me on the stand. In the morning, I wore the suit from my retirement ceremony. The Deacon County Probate Court sits on the 2nd floor of a limestone building older than anyone's grievances, and the courtroom itself is small. Oak benches, a ceiling fan that ticks, an Ohio flag gone soft with age. Small matters in a room like that. Every breath is public. My parents were already seated when I came in, my father in his funeral and wedding suit, my mother in church blue, and behind them Aunt Bev, arms crossed like a fence. Arlene sat on my side in her good coat, spine straight, a 2nd-grade teacher waiting out an assembly. Tom Reyes had his notebook. The caseworker file sat on the clerk's cart with everything in it. Their attorney intercepted us in the aisle, one last copy of the agreement in hand, and made his pitch quietly, reasonably, the way good lawyers sell certainty. "Sign now, we all go home, the family heals in private." I looked past his shoulder while he talked. My mother was watching me with her hands knotted at her chest, and she mouthed a single word at me across that courtroom. "Please." I took the paper from him. I laid it on the rail, and across the signature block I wrote the word "declined" in block capitals, dated it like a soldier dates everything, and handed it back. My mother closed her eyes. My father never turned around. I watched the back of his neck take the news and settle, almost satisfied, because a fight was a language he respected. Magistrate Hollis took the bench at 9 sharp, a gray, precise woman with reading glasses on a chain, and called the matter of the guardianship of Ellie Grace Ingram, minor child. Their side stood. "Your Honor, the objectors call Walter Ingram." My father buttoned his jacket, walked to the stand, and put his hand on the Bible like a man who had been waiting his whole life to be asked. I will say this about my father. He did not lie up there. He sat straight, spoke slow, and laid his life's philosophy on the record with the pride of a mason showing his wall. Yes, he'd put the child out on the porch. Yes, he'd latched the door. He described it as a standard correction, a method with a track record. And when his lawyer asked about the storm, he said what he'd said in his kitchen: "Storm's just water." And 2 heads in the gallery actually nodded. I watched Magistrate Hollis write something down. Then his attorney turned him toward me, and the real strategy stood up and showed itself. Wasn't it true that his daughter had been absent from the child's life for a full year? That the child had thrived at the farm? School records, church attendance, a vegetable garden? That the mother's household was barely 8 months old, her civilian job not yet started, her own treatment records. And here the lawyer paused, letting the word treatment ring. Sealed from this court's view? And then my father did the thing I knew was coming and still wasn't ready for. He pointed at me, not rudely, proudly. "Look at her," he told the courtroom. 20 years, United States Army, steady as a post. You think that grew in soft soil? I built that. My father built me, and I built her. And all I was doing was building the little one, same as I was built. He was offering me to the court as Exhibit A. My service, my steadiness, my whole survived life, entered into evidence as proof the latch works. The doctrine had found its perfect closing argument, and the argument was my face. Klein leaned into my ear as his testimony wound down and gave me the exit one final time. "Last chance, Dana. We can rest on the county's file. You don't have to take the stand. Your records stay sealed." The magistrate shuffled papers. Their lawyer said, "Nothing further." And I stood up. Here is the thing nobody in that courtroom knew, not even Klein, because I had only fully decided it somewhere between the aisle and my feet. I was done letting silence be the family's load-bearing wall. "Your Honor," I said, "I'd like to testify. And before I do, so no one wonders what I'm hiding, I waive privilege on my counseling records, the vet center file, all of it. The court can read every page." The room did that small-town thing where nobody moves and everything shifts. My mother's chair creaked. Their attorney came halfway out of his seat, scenting either gift or trap and unable to tell which. Klein looked at me for a long second, closed her eyes exactly once, like a woman folding a losing hand she'd played perfectly, and then nodded and said, "Petitioner calls Dana Ingram." Walking those 15 feet took 29 years. I put my hand on the same Bible my father had used, sat down, adjusted the microphone the way I'd adjusted 100 radios, and found my daughter's freezer-bagged sneakers in my mind and set them on the rail where I could see them. Klein's first question was the one we'd rehearsed. "State your name and your relationship to the child." "Dana Ingram. I'm her mother." Her second question was the one we had never rehearsed because I'd told her at the counsel table in a whisper that the plan had changed. "Ms. Ingram," she said, steady as a metronome, "your father testified that his methods never hurt you. Take your time. Tell the court about the smokehouse." My father's head came up. My mother's hand went to her mouth. And outside the tall second-floor windows, I swear on my discharge papers, it began. Soft at first, then steady. To rain. "I was 9, I said, and my voice held. "The winter my grandfather died. And until this morning, I have never told this to a single living soul. My grandfather's funeral was on a Thursday. I cried at the graveside. I was 9, and he was the only man who ever let me sit on his lap and just be small. That evening my father told me crying was a habit, and habits break outdoors. There was a storm coming up from the river valley. He walked me out to the smokehouse, past the woodpile, put me inside with the cured hams and the cold dirt floor, and set the latch. It had one window, high up, wired glass. I watched the storm through it most of the night. I was wearing my funeral dress. I counted the thunder. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. Because somewhere in the dark I worked out that if I was counting, I wasn't crying, and if I wasn't crying by morning, the door would open. Toward dawn I fell asleep on a feed sack, and when my mother let me out, she'd brought me cocoa. And nobody in that house ever spoke of it again. I made myself a promise, walking back across that yard, 9 years old, in a wrinkled funeral dress. Nobody would ever see me cry again. I kept that promise through basic training, through 2 deployments, through a divorce, and a flag-folded funeral for a soldier I couldn't save, and the birth of my own daughter. The nurses joked they'd never seen a calmer delivery. For 29 years I called that promise strength, and I built a career on it, and my father just sat in that chair and claimed my whole life as his good work. I turned then and looked at him. the man in his funeral and wedding suit, and kept my voice as soft as I have ever kept it in this life. Dad, you always said it never hurt me. It never stopped hurting me. I went to counseling to unlearn your house. That file they wanted so badly says a woman spent 20 years being strong and is finally learning to be well. Strong and fine are not the same thing, and I will spend every dollar I have making sure my daughter never has to know the difference. The silence held for a heartbeat. Then my father came up out of his seat like a wall failing, and for the first time in my whole life, Walt Ingram shouted, "I made you what you are!" The gavel came down once. My father stood there in the ringing quiet, breathing hard, a 9-year-old on a frozen bank wearing a 69-year-old's face, and every person in that small oak room had just watched the method testify against itself. What remained took under an hour, and I remember it in still frames. Arlene on the stand in her good coat, describing the doormat, the soaked pajamas, the blue lips, in sentences you could carve into limestone. The county's file, entered without objection, my father's own quotes read into the record while he stared at the flag. And then, Tom Reyes, unreadable Tom, opening his little notebook to give the guardian ad litem's recommendation, and the magistrate asking what the child herself had said about where she feels safe. Reyes found the page. She told me, "Home is where my mom checks the locks twice. Locks keeping the weather out," she said. "Not keeping her out?" He closed the notebook. "This office recommends termination, Your Honor, and recommends against any court-ordered visitation at this time." Magistrate Hollis took off her reading glasses. She spoke plainly. The law presumes a fit parent. The presumption had not been dented, and the evidence— she looked at my father over the top of her frames for a long, level moment— ran considerably in the other direction. Guardianship terminated. Full parental rights and custody restored to the mother. The motion for grandparent visitation denied. She signed the entry right there. 1 page, 1 signature, and the clerk stamped it. And that stamp, that little mechanical thunk, was the whole war ending. I want to tell you, winning felt like fireworks. It felt like a field going quiet. My mother walked past me in the aisle with her purse held in both hands like something rescued from a fire, and did not look at me, and I understood I had just heard her voice for the last time in a courtroom or maybe anywhere. My father stopped at the door and he did look. A long look, no shout left in it, and in his eyes I finally saw the actual cost of the day, the item no entry can restore. The father I had spent 20 years imagining, the one who was hard because someday he'd tell me it was all for love, that man had never existed. I had the signed page in my hand. Both things were true at once, and I carried them both out into the rain. I won't dress up what came after, because real endings don't tie. My father never apologized. Not that week. Not since. The prosecutor's office closed its file for good. At First Baptist, some pews still go quiet when I walk past, and Aunt Bev still tells her version at the deli case. The doctrine didn't die in that courtroom. It just lost one house. I went full no contact the day the entry was stamped. Numbers blocked. School pickup list rewritten to 2 names, mine and Arlene's. One morning in June, I found a cardboard box on my porch. No note, no knock. Inside were things from the farm, my old 4-H ribbons, a christening gown, a photograph of me at 7 on my grandfather's lap, my mother's handwriting on the flaps, my mother's tape, my mother's silence. I stood there a long time. Then I kept the photograph, donated the rest, and let the box be what it was, the closest thing to a love letter that house knew how to send. The rebuilding was quieter than the war, the way it always is. Ellie kept her sand tray appointments, and the nightmares faded to visitors instead of tenants. I started the logistics job at the clinic network, civilian hours, home by 5:30. I still see Ray at the vet center every other Thursday, and I'm faster now at the hard call, the one that just says, "Come sit with me." And one Saturday, Ellie and I held a small ceremony in the backyard for a pair of purple sneakers. I finally unzipped the freezer bag. We thanked them for their service. She saluted. I taught her a proper one, for carrying a brave girl 200 yards through the mud to a porch light. Then we retired them, full honors, into the trash bin, and drove to the store, where she picked the new pair herself. Purple again, but louder. Her choice. Everything about that sentence still gets me. Her choice. In late July, a storm came up the valley on a Friday evening, the first big one since April, and I watched my daughter watch the sky. I asked her if she wanted to go inside. She thought about it like the meteorologist she's decided to become, then shook her head and climbed onto the porch swing next to me. So we stayed, two Ingram women under one dry roof, cocoa in July thick air, front door standing wide open behind us with the light on. When the first thunder rolled, Ellie grinned and started counting. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. Out loud, theatrical, holding up fingers, and I counted with her. And when we lost the count, we just laughed and started over. Counting thunder used to be what the children of that farmhouse did in the dark to keep from crying. Now it's a game my daughter plays on a porch swing with her mother, with the door open, keeping score of how far away the weather is. In this house, a storm is just weather. In this house, nobody stands outside alone. If you take one thing from my story, take this. Being strong carried me through 20 years of service, but it took my daughter shivering on a neighbor's porch to teach me that a child doesn't need to be toughened. She needs to be safe. And the bravest thing a strong woman ever does is admit where her strength came from. That's my story. One storm, one phone call, one promise I finally broke. The promise to stay quiet. If it reminded you that protecting your child matters more than protecting the family's image, take that as your sign. Share this video with someone who needs it tonight. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have done at that settlement table. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.